5 Japanese trepang fishermen lay dead on the shores of Caledon Bay, killed by Yolngu warriors who had decided that enough was enough. The year was 1932, and in the remote coastal stretches of Arnhem Land, a reckoning had arrived that the Australian government never wanted the public to understand. For years, Japanese fishing crews had been operating along the northern coastline with a freedom that bordered on impunity. They harvested sea cucumbers from waters the Yolngu had fished for thousands of years. But the Trepangers weren't just taking marine life, they were taking women. Yolngu women were coerced, traded and abused by Japanese poachers who operated beyond the reach of any law that cared to intervene, and the local police knew, in some cases they were complicit. What happened at Caledon Bay wasn't a random act of violence. It was a response to years of exploitation that had been met with silence from every institution that should have acted. But the full truth of what provoked those killings and what the government did next would remain buried for more than 60 years. The Japanese trepang trade along Australia's northern coast had deep roots, stretching back to the 18th century, when Makassar fishermen from present-day Indonesia first made seasonal voyages to Arnhem Land. By the early 20th century, Japanese operators had largely displaced the Macassans, running more aggressive commercial operations that pushed deeper into Yolngu territory. These weren't diplomatic trading relationships. The Japanese crews arrived in luggers, set up camps on the coastline, and processed sea cucumbers for export to Asian markets. They needed labor, they wanted women, and in the absence of any meaningful government oversight across the vast and sparsely policed Northern Territory, they took both. Yolngu men were pressed into service on the boats. Yolngu women were subjected to sexual abuse that ranged from coercion to outright abduction. The community's protests went nowhere. Complaints to authorities were ignored or dismissed. The power imbalance was total, and it was enforced not by law, but by the complete absence of it. The Yolngu were not passive witnesses to their own dispossession. They had a legal and moral framework older than the Australian state itself, and within that framework, the response to sustained violation was clear. In September 1933, the situation escalated beyond anything the government could quietly manage. Constable Albert McColl traveled to Wooda Island to investigate the earlier Japanese deaths. He brought with him a tracker, and he brought assumptions about Aboriginal compliance that would prove fatal. McColl was killed by Yolngu warriors, along with his companion. The details of McColl's own conduct in the region remain contested, but what is not contested is that he operated within a frontier policing culture that treated Aboriginal people as subjects to be managed rather than citizens with rights. Reports from the period, later corroborated by missionary and anthropological sources, placed McColl within a network of authorities who turned a blind eye to the exploitation of Indigenous women by Japanese fishermen. Some accounts went further, suggesting direct involvement. His death transformed the Caledon Bay situation from a remote frontier incident into a national crisis. The Australian press seized on the killing of a white constable. Editorials demanded retribution. Politicians faced pressure to act decisively, and the machinery of punitive response began to turn. What almost no one asked, at least not publicly, was why the Yolngu had killed him. The government's response followed a pattern that had repeated across the Australian frontier for over a century. Armed police expeditions were dispatched into Arnhem Land with instructions that, while officially restrained, carried the unmistakable weight of retribution. These were not investigations. They were shows of force directed at communities that had already endured years of abuse. Police and military personnel moved through Yolngu country, intimidating communities, seizing individuals, and imposing the authority of a state that had failed to protect the very people it now sought to punish. The expeditions operated in territory so remote that oversight was impossible and accountability non-existent. What happened in the bush stayed in the bush. That was the unwritten rule of frontier policing in the Northern Territory, and everyone involved understood it. The Yolngu men identified as responsible for the killings were eventually taken into custody. The legal proceedings that followed would become one of the more unusual episodes in Australian judicial history, but the punitive expeditions themselves left scars across Arnhem Land communities that would persist for generations. Into this volatile landscape walked Donald Thompson, a Melbourne anthropologist and missionary who arrived in Arnhem Land in 1935 under government commission. His mandate was straightforward: pacify the region and restore order. What he found instead compelled him to turn his gaze back toward the government that had sent him. Thompson lived among the Yolngu for extended periods. He learned language, he earned trust, and he documented with methodical precision the conditions that had produced the violence at Caledon Bay. His reports detailed the sexual exploitation of Yolngu women by Japanese Trepangers. They described the complicity and participation of local police. They catalogued a frontier regime in which Aboriginal people existed outside the protection of law while remaining fully subject to its punishment. Thompson's findings were explosive. They directly contradicted the official narrative of unprovoked Aboriginal savagery. They implicated government agents in the very abuses that had triggered the killings. And they painted a picture of colonial administration so negligent that it amounted to institutional collaboration with the exploitation of its own subjects. The government received his reports, and then the government made them disappear. Thompson's classified reports were sealed, not redacted, not summarized for public consumption, not filed in accessible archives, sealed. The decision was deliberate, and its purpose transparent. The Australian government could not allow a documented, credible account of frontier sexual violence and police complicity to reach public consciousness at a time when the official position held that Aboriginal affairs were being managed responsibly. This was not a unique act of suppression. Across the 20th century, Australian governments at both state and federal levels maintained a practiced relationship with inconvenient truths about Aboriginal policy, protection boards that functioned as instruments of control, child removal programs justified by racial pseudoscience, labor exploitation legalized through legislation that paid Aboriginal workers a fraction of white wages or nothing at all. The pattern was consistent. Harm was administered through policy, and evidence of that harm was managed through silence. Thompson himself continued his advocacy for Yolngu rights for years, but without the documentary ammunition that his sealed reports represented, his was a voice arguing against a wall of official denial. He died in 1970. His reports remained locked away. It was not until the 1990s that researchers working through Australian archives began to locate and publish Thompson's long-buried findings. More than 60 years after the events at Caledon Bay, the documented evidence of what had actually happened and why finally entered the public record. The reports confirmed what Yolngu oral histories had maintained all along. The killings were not acts of random savagery. They were responses to specific, sustained, and documented abuses. Japanese Trepangers had exploited Yolngu women with the knowledge and tacit approval of local authorities. Police had failed in their duty of protection and, in some cases, actively participated in the exploitation. The Yolngu had acted within their own legal traditions to address violations that the colonial legal system refused to acknowledge. The Unsealing also revealed the calculated nature of the suppression itself. These were not documents lost through bureaucratic negligence. They were documents deliberately removed from circulation because their contents threatened the legitimacy of the state's conduct on the frontier. The Caledon Bay crisis occupies an uncomfortable space in Australian history. It is not a story of misunderstanding or cultural collision. It is a story of exploitation, resistance, punishment, and cover-up, each element flowing logically from the last. The Yolngu who killed the Japanese Trepangers and Constable McColl were eventually brought to trial in Darwin. Their case attracted significant public attention, and figures including Thompson and others argued for leniency on the grounds of provocation. Several of the accused were convicted, but received relatively light sentences, a rare acknowledgement, however incomplete, that the violence had not emerged from nothing. But the larger accountability never came. No government official faced consequences for the suppression of Thompson's reports. No formal reckoning addressed the sexual exploitation of Yolngu women that had been known to authorities for years. The trepang trade continued, the frontier police culture persisted, and the sealed archives sat in darkness, holding truths that an entire nation had decided were too dangerous to speak. Today, the Yolngu communities of Arnhem Land carry this history in ways that official Australia is only beginning to understand. The memory of Caledon Bay is not distant for them. It lives in family stories, in place names, in a relationship with government authority shaped by generations of broken trust. When Thompson's reports finally surfaced, they did not reveal anything the Yolngu did not already know. They simply confirmed it in the language that the colonizers' own institutions could no longer deny. The question Caledon Bay poses is not whether these things happened. The archive has settled that. The question is what it means that a government could know, could document, could seal, and could wait 60 years gambling correctly that by the time the truth emerged, most of the people who lived it would be gone.